Some of my favorite, sorry about that. Some of my favorite memories in the last 15 years. A lot of you know that Don Weiss and I, even for those of you who have never met me in the flesh, Don Weiss and I in 2008, 2009 came to Cambridge. We had never met before that season, and we started HCFA together. And some of my favorite memories over the years are riding my bike over to campus from Somerville or from Watertown on Friday night when DOXA used to be, and worshiping with HCFA. And so what a great experience tonight, even from afar, to get to worship with you guys. If you have your Bibles, I encourage you to turn to the Gospel of Mark. We'll get there in a few minutes. By the way, quick kind of survey question. When I read a passage of scripture, we're only going to look at one main passage tonight, but it'll be the entire chapter of Mark 13. Would it be helpful for me to put it up on the screen from like BibleGateway.com, or should I just read it out loud and you look at it on your phones or on your Bibles? Anybody have a preference? Okay, I'll put it on the screen. I see a couple people saying that. Okay, I'll do that in a couple of minutes. So a few weeks ago, Fetty, and I think Tyler as well, reached out to me, asked me to come back and do this. It's always great to be with you guys, and kind of just said that the overall topic they were interested in, and I'm guessing that this reflects hopefully some of your interest, is just how do we think about the future as Christians? And of course, that's a very broad topic. There's the more kind of like specific theological questions that are there. A lot of people today often say that maybe the resurrection of Jesus is the most embarrassing aspect of the Christian faith to believe as a modern person. And it certainly is difficult, but I think probably both from my perception of other people, but also my own experience, that the more future-oriented stuff is more embarrassing. Like the second coming of Jesus, the return of Christ in the future, the idea that there'll be kind of a final judgment and kind of this ultimate future for creation, for the world that's there, but especially in light of what the last year has been like for all of us, and just by nature of being human, I think we're always fascinated by the future. We always long to know what it holds. We always fear and are deeply anxious over what is coming in the future. Every experience of anxiety you have always felt is flowing out of, at least in part, your perception or your uncertainty about the future. The future is really, really practical, really important, but also really intimidating because it often feels like there's very little we can know about it. And so there's a lot of different directions we could go tonight. I'm gonna, go for the next maybe 45, 50 minutes, whatever it ends up being. And then we're gonna get to do some Q&A. As I thought about, this is such a big topic. There's so many directions we could go. Should I do this? Should I do that? I decided pretty early on that it would be better to look at something very specific and to look at it well, rather than to try to talk about 12 things superficially. And so just real quick, a couple of the things that I want to introduce, and you guys are Harvard students and Columbia students, and so you'll know this. I'm gonna not even so much introduce two words here, because many of you will have heard them, but for some of you, they might be new, and that's absolutely fine. But I'm gonna mention these two words. I'm actually gonna put them in the chat box in a second. And I want you to hear a couple of things here. One is that I really think it's important for us to know what these words refer to as Christians, even though they are, to be honest, kind of nerdy and really abstract. That understanding what they mean, what their content is really practical and really important in the Christian faith. On the other hand, second, I want to encourage you, don't go home and start using these words with other people. The challenge is to translate them into the vernacular. But just as there's lots of things that you're learning in your Harvard studies, your Columbia studies in this years, and when you get into a conversation with someone who doesn't have the same background in the same field of expertise as you can't just talk as if you're back in the classroom, but nonetheless, hopefully what you learned in the classroom helped you actually communicate to other people without that background in the same way. And so I want to just mention two words real quick. The first is this, eschatology. The second is this, apocalyptic. They both are straight from the Greek language, and some of you will have heard them before. Some of you, they might be new. Eschatology, and this is not the main point tonight, I just want to give us some common language for thinking about the future together. Eschatology is just from the Greek word eschatos, which means last. And just as theology or biology is the study of God or the study of life, eschatology is the study of, depending on how you understand it, either the last things temporally or the ultimate things teleologically. Traditionally, Christians of various traditions tend to understand there to be four great last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. I'll give an example in a second, but there's lots of big, dorky, dry, abstract, boring theology books. Here's one. This is volume 4 of a 4-volume series, and this volume is called Reformed Dogmatics, Holy Spirit, Church, and New Creation. And the reason I mention that is whenever you pick up a big, boring Christian theology book, eschatology, the last things, is always literally the last thing in the book. It's the last chapter in the book. And I think that's a mistake to think about it like that. I'll come back to that in just a second. But eschatology is a topic. It's a theme. It's thinking about the future, both in a temporal sense, what is still to come, but also in an ultimate sense. What's the point of the whole story? You don't really know what a story is about until the final scene has unfolded. And so for us to make sense of what the story is about right now, we need to have some sense of where it's going. And eschatology is the traditional word that Christians use for studying the last things, the ultimate things. The other word I put up, apocalyptic, is probably used a little more often in our culture, but used almost always in different ways or wrong ways. Many of you, when you hear the word apocalyptic, might hear like end of the world, it kind of like the apocalypse, but that has nothing to do with what the word means. The word in Greek literally just refers to unveiling or revealing something that was previously hidden. It has nothing to do with the end of the world, at least not necessarily. An apocalyptic moment is when the eyes of the blind are opened, when God shows us something that our empirical pursuits, our empirical 5 senses could not have discovered. I'm going to give some examples of that later on. And so here's the first distinction I want to make. Eschatology is a theme or a topic. Apocalyptic is a genre. It's a way of communicating to human beings that engages our imagination. A lot of the mistakes that Christians make with apocalyptic is reading it too literally. I'll define later on what I mean by that, and thinking that it's primarily cognitive, that it's primarily propositional facts about the future before it happens, rather than understanding it as approaching us through our imaginations. These are arguably 2 of the main ways Christians historically think about the future, and Mark 13 is a passage we're going to look at in a few minutes, and it is in the genre of apocalyptic. Jesus uses imagery of the sun going dark, of the moon bleeding, of the stars falling from heaven, of kind of cosmic earthquakes, of all kinds of wars and rumors of wars. It's apocalyptic. It's speaking to our imagination. And unless we know the logic of how this works, we often miss what Jesus or other biblical writers are saying. And so let me, in one sense, Don Weiss asked me this a little while ago before the meeting started. What do I hope that you guys kind of walk away from this meeting tonight? I really do want it to be practical and not dry or abstract, even if it's interesting, but really practical, really relevant. And if there's one word that really captures what we're going for tonight, it's hope. That I hope you have both a clearer understanding of what it is we hope for as the people of God, why we hope for it, and maybe even more importantly, that you would feel more motivated, more confident to hope for what God has promised his people in the world. And so let me say 3 things about hope before we look at Mark 13. There's a lot you could say about hope. For instance, with respect to eschatology, here's a helpful way to think about how it relates to other fields of study, other aspects of our experience. Immanuel Kant, in the late 1700s, wrote in his Critique of Pure Reason that philosophy, and then I would just broaden that to any human inquiry in general, that's serious, philosophy is concerned with 3 questions above all else. The first question is, what can I know? What can I know? And some of you will know that that's the field of epistemology. How do we know what we know? How do I know I'm not deceived in believing what I believe about the world, but that what I know connects with reality? How can I know what I think I know? That's epistemology. All 3 of these words are E words. Kant said the second question is, what must I do? And that's ethics. What's my moral duty? So there's epistemology, there's ethics. What can I know? What must I do? And the third question, I think, is probably the unexpected one, if you know Kant, but also in light of our culture today, where everything is here and now, everything is empirical, everything is on the surface. Kant said the third question that philosophy, human inquiry must seek to answer is the question, what may I hope for? And that's eschatology. Eschatology teaches us what we may and may not hope for. And because of that, it's very, very important. And so, with respect to hope, let me say we could not only do the whole talk tonight just on hope specifically, we could do multiple talks and not even come close to exhausting hope. I just want to say three things about hope to kind of set the framework for Mark 13. Here's the first one, that hope is a virtue in the Christian faith. Some of you know, will remember and know that in the ancient world, there were four cardinal virtues. There's prudence, there's temperance, there was justice, there was courage. That's especially Greek philosophy, but it kind of got more widespread than that. And going at least all the way back to Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages, but arguably even before that, Christians kind of riffed on that and said, if there are four cardinal virtues, which all human beings can access and pursue and experience by virtue of creation and common grace, there are three theological virtues that require saving grace to really experience, to really embody. And a lot of you will probably know what they are. You could guess that they're faith, hope, and love. Faith, hope, and love are the three virtues that should both ground the cardinal virtues, shape them, motivate them, direct them, but also that cannot be experienced by everyone just by virtue of being human in creation, but require revelation, require the Spirit, require a saving experience of God's grace in response to him. So faith, hope, and love. And if we had time, I would have even loved in another setting to maybe have this be interactive here. If you would go around and say, is one of those, faith, hope, and love, greater than the others, more important than the others, a priority over the others? Some of you might immediately think, I'm not sure. Some of you might think, oh yeah, it's definitely this one. And I would guess that if we had the time to go around that, maybe most of you would say love is the greatest, because you'll remember 1 Corinthians 13, that faith, hope, and love remain, but the greatest of these is love. But I also think that that can be very easily misunderstood. I think in an ultimate sense, faith, hope, and love can each, depending on the perspective that we approach them from, each of them can be considered rightly to be more important than the other two, depending on what question we are asking. And so 1 Corinthians 13 says that love is greater than faith and hope, because in the ultimate future, when Jesus returns, when God makes the world new again, when everything has been set right that has gone wrong, we will never again, on the other side of the resurrection from the dead, we will never again in the life of the world to come ever exercise faith or hope ever again. Because faith is what you exercise when you can't see. The opposite of faith is not reason. The opposite of faith is sight. And we will see God face to face, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13. And as Paul says in Romans 8, who hopes for what he currently experiences? You only hope for something you don't have right now, but that's coming in the future. So a day is coming when you will never hope and you will never trust again, but you will always love forever. As Jonathan Edwards says, heaven is a world of love. So with respect to both teleology and the ultimate future, temporally, love is the greatest. But as Paul says in another place in his letters, in Galatians, there's another sense in which faith has the priority. Paul says in Galatians 5 that the only thing that matters is faith that works through love and on the basis of which we hope for righteousness. That he mentions all three, but here, if you don't have faith, then you don't have love and you don't have hope. And so there in Galatians, faith is the crucial one. And there's many places we could look at, but I'll just mention one. In Colossians 1, Paul begins the letter by saying, I give thanks to God for you, the Colossians, because of your faith in the Lord Jesus and your love for all the saints, which are themselves rooted in your hope in the future that God has laid up for you in heaven. Their hope is, so to speak, the motivational engine that gives rise to both ongoing faith in God and love for our neighbors and other people. And so if you don't have hope, you run out of steam with faith and with love. And so hope is a virtue. It's not the only virtue. In some ways, it's not the primary virtue. But nonetheless, I want to make a bold statement. Without hope, it is impossible to be a Christian. It is impossible, I think, even to fully, truly be human as we were created to be, to lose hope in some sense. As Augustine said in the early church, he who ceases to hope ceases to be a human being. That this is really, really crucial to being human well. And so hope is a virtue. And what I mean, one way to think about what I mean when I say hope is a virtue is that if someone gives up on the future, and I don't mean to be critical here, I don't mean to make light of it, but if someone finally gives in to despair, if someone finally gives in to cynicism, in the logic of the Christian faith, the way that should be articulated, understood, named, is not that they've made a miscalculation, but that they have a character flaw. Not that they have made an error, but that they have sinned. That hope is a virtue that requires a moral stance of the heart. We tend to think about hope as just connected to cognition in the mind, but it's actually a virtue. I almost always get around to some point or another, many of you will remember this, even if you've never met me, to citing the Lord of the Rings at some point. If you read The Lord of the Rings, arguably one of the ways to describe it is a story about the battle between hope and despair. Almost every major character is either understood positively or negatively. Aragorn, Gandalf, Frodo, Sam, because in the great face of temptation to despair, they still choose to hope against great odds. And all the tragic characters, Boromir, Denethor, Saruman, their wickedness, their evil is motivated by they lost hope and they have despaired, and so they go off the rails. Maybe my favorite scene in all of the Lord of the Rings is there's this scene in the second book where the good guys are surrounded at Helm's Deep, and it just looks like they're about to be massacred, and Legolas loses his temper as Aragorn tries to motivate the troops. And it's basically like a bunch of old guys and a bunch of kids, none of whom really know how to fight. And Legolas basically goes off in front of everybody and says, "Why are you even bothering? We're all gonna die." And he despairs in that moment. And the next day, Legolas comes back and he says something that I think is so deeply Christian in its understanding, is he says to Aragorn, "I'm sorry that I despaired." He doesn't say I made a miscalculation. He doesn't say I did the math wrong in my head. He says I was wrong to despair. That hope is a virtue and despair is a vice. But that's really hard in our world, to hope and to not despair. Just to be completely transparent, I struggle every day of my life with despair. I struggle every day of my life with cynicism. Hope is not easy for me, but it is a virtue that is meant to fuel faith, that is meant to fuel love. And I think it behooves all of us as Christians, even just as human beings, to think through how can we grow in this theological virtue of hope. And that's what teaching about eschatology and apocalyptic is there for. It's not so that we know fancy words that come from Greek, it's so that we can grow in hope and therefore in faith and in love. On the other hand, I want to say this about hope, and this itself I could get into at much more depth, that hope is dangerous. One of the most consistent critiques of Christianity, and I would say religion in general, and it's often a justified critique, is that it's a pie in the sky mentality to either comfort people to not deal with their own harsh realities in their life, or more likely a ploy, intentionally or unintentionally, by the privileged and the powerful to keep those who are oppressed or those who are downtrodden not complaining about their lot in life. Because look, you got this stuff coming in the future, it doesn't matter right now. Rowan Williams, one of my favorite contemporary theologians, he was, a couple of years ago, the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is the highest ranking position in the Church of England. And in his book, Christ on Trial, here's what Rowan Williams says: "It is quite possible to persuade people of the importance of present renunciation, not being focused on the fact that life right now is hard and sorrowful, in the face of present apparent failure, when there is a sure promise of how things will turn out for the best in the future." And Christians have often done this historically. "We are encouraged," Rowan Williams says, "to make the present that bit of our life, of our experience, that is less real than the future. And within this is a rather problematic element. This can be the beginning of an attitude that in which we are always trying to escape from the pain of the present, or even worse, trying to deny the harshness of someone else's present because of the future that I believe in. Again, this is all too recognizable a problem in religious history. It can be one of the most insidious ways in which religious power is corruptly exercised by telling people that their actual present experience is what they must ignore if they wish to be faithful believers. And hope often functions in that toxic, corrupt, broken way. And so I want to acknowledge hope is dangerous. If it's a virtue, it can also be abused, it can be misused, and it can become death dealing in an individual's life or in a community. So we need to be careful about what hope is doing. In fact, in a second, and I'll end here by tonight, I'm going to argue that the past is important and that the future is important, but I'm going to make an argument with almost no nuance at all that right here, right now, is the most important moment in the universe. That right here, right now, is more important than the future and is more important than the past. And the role that the future and the past play is to bring us back here and now to be faithful to what God is doing right here and now. So insofar as the future becomes a form of escapism or the past becomes a form of nostalgia, they're dangerous and they're corrupted. Here, now, even in Mark 13, with all of its fantastic imagery of the future, with all of its hyper focus on what is still to come, ends with the repeated call, right now, right here, stay awake, be on guard, follow Jesus in spite of all the temptations to lose heart or to become distracted. Right here is ultimately what our focus is on and ultimately what is required of us. And any glance we take at the future, any glance we take at the past is subordinate to fueling our faithfulness right here and now. And so I want to just acknowledge that hope can be very dangerous. It's not everything. It's not even the main thing, but it is a virtue. And then finally, I just want to say that it's necessary. No one can really walk through life without taking into consideration what's coming in the future. This is another topic that I often teach on. Not going to get into it tonight, but I often use this very simple, in some ways, oversimplification of a mathematical equation, referring to memory of the past, hope for the future, or if you don't want to use the word hope, just more generically, anticipation of the future. I would say that if you understand human psychology, whether you're aware of this in your life or not, whether another person is aware of it in their life or not, that basically the way you remember the past plus the way you anticipate what the future will look like equals your perception and your experience of right here and now. That over and over and over again, the people of God are criticized in scripture for forgetting what God did in the past and for only focusing on my belly's hungry right now. Can you give me what I want, God? And not anticipating what is still to come. Memory of the past, anticipation of the future. I would say we don't usually think about it in this way. I would say memory of the past, what God has done, what has happened, and anticipation of what God has promised in the future are two of the most foundational spiritual disciplines you can ever grow your skills in. Every day, spend time remembering the past. Insofar as right now feels overwhelming or depressing, or just an opportunity for you to be selfish and to ignore your neighbor and ignore God, it's because, among other things, you're failing to remember the fullness of what the past has been. Insofar as you're encountering right here and now in a broken way, you're not taking into view the fullness of what God has given us in the future. And so remembering the past, imagining the future, two of the most important spiritual disciplines for Christians. Tonight, we're focusing more on hoping for, imagining the future. Okay, so let's go to Mark 13. I'm going to read it out loud. I'm going to put it up on the screen, and then I'm going to say three things about it overall, and then we'll have time for Q&A. Let me go ahead and share this screen. I'm going to read in the ESV, but feel free to kind of look at any translation you want. Mark 13 is often known as the Olivet Discourse. Okay, can you guys see that? This is from BibleGateway.com. Mark 13 is the Olivet Discourse. In context, this is not only the final week of Jesus's life. In Mark 11, he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. He has already had that famous scene when he clears out the temple. He has already told the parable of the vineyard against the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And now, right before he gets arrested in Mark 14 and brought on trial, and then crucified in Mark 15. So depending on how you understand the timeline, this could be 24 to 48 hours before Jesus is crucified. It's difficult to always figure out the chronology, but this is at the very end. And there's a parallel in Matthew 24 and Luke 21. And as often happens in the Gospels, the later Gospels, Matthew 24, Luke 21, they flesh out what is said in Mark 13. So if you really want to dive into this, I encourage you, go check out Matthew 24, Luke 21 later on. But let me read this, and then I'll switch the screen off, and we'll come back and we'll look at this passage for a bit. Mark 13. And as Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." This is the temple in Jerusalem, and it really is one of the wonders of the ancient world. It's a really impressive building, and the disciples just say, "Look at this amazing building, the temple in Jerusalem." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Translation, don't be too impressed. This whole thing's coming down. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately. So this is not public teaching. This is only for his disciples. "Tell us, Jesus, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" Notice questions about the future. And Jesus began to say to them, "See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name saying, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. But be on your guard. For they will deliver you," future tense, "over to councils." That's literally the word for Sanhedrin. That's a Jewish ruling council. "And you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings." Those are Gentile rulers in the Roman Empire. "For my sake, to bear witness before them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour, for it is not you who is speaking, but the Holy Spirit. And brother will deliver brother over to death." It's betrayal within family, within friends. "The father his child, and the children will rise against their own parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by everyone for my name's sake. But it is the one who endures to the end who will be saved." Now here's where you really begin to see the apocalyptic imagery. "But when you see the abomination of desolation," that's a phrase that first shows up in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, "standing where he ought not to be." And you can see this is in parentheses here. The parentheses are not in Greek. This is an editorial decision, but I think right. "Let the reader understand." And it's at least pointing out that Jesus is speaking. He's not writing this down. This is Mark's editorial comment. Let the reader understand what Jesus is talking about here. "So when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not to be, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." It's a scene of panic. "Let the one who is on the housetop not go down nor enter his house to take anything out." You're just running out as quick as you can. You're not even grabbing anything to take with you. "And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and who are nursing infants," small children in those days. "Pray that whatever this is, that it might not happen in winter. For in those days, there will be such tribulation as has never been from the beginning of creation, which God created until now and never will be again." Sounds really bad. "And if the Lord had not cut short these days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, whom God chose, he shortened the days. And then, once those days are shortened and the tribulation begins to wrap up, then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders, kind of like Pharaoh's magicians in the book of Exodus, to lead astray, if possible, even God's elect. But be on your guard. We're going to come back to this. Jesus claims, I have told you all things beforehand. Like, what does that mean? Like if we were paying attention, we should have known COVID-19 was coming before it happened. Like, what does it mean that I've told you everything beforehand? And obviously it doesn't mean that. So we'll come back and we'll think about, what does it mean that Jesus has told us, let's maybe put it another way, everything you need to know about the future, I have told you. And then we read this, and this is maybe the most famous section, but also the most debated. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heaven will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. If any of you have grown up in American Christianity, you almost certainly grew up hearing that that's a kind of a literal description of the second coming of Jesus at the end of the world. I'm going to argue in a little while, it's nothing of the sort. That has no reference to that at all, but we'll come back to that in a little while. Jesus comes back in verse 28, and he says, from the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as this branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, and that seems to be, everything I told you in the first 27 verses, when you see all these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. And here's maybe the first obvious sign that something is wrong if we're reading this literally as the end of the world. That Jesus says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all of these things have taken place. Generation there means a time period. This current generation that is alive, it always means that in the Gospels. And all these things clearly means verses 1 through 27. All of that will take place before a generation passes away. And then he makes it even worse. If you're feeling tense about this, he stakes his reputation on this and says, guys, one day heaven and earth will pass away. But what I just said here, you can take it to the bank. These words are good to go. These words are not going to pass away. You can trust what I've just told you about the future. Some of you might know that many modern critical scholars believe that Jesus and in general, the first generation of the early church were, you could almost say, apocalyptic freaks who were sitting around waiting for the world to end and were convinced that it was all going to end within 30 or 40 years. And then the rest of church history is the church compromising and making do with the fact that the foundational promise of the Messiah never came to pass. And we're going to come back to this and wrestle with it. But verse 32, concerning that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, not even the Son, not even Jesus. This was a big debate in the early church that Jesus says he doesn't know something. God the Father knows the hour, the day. But Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, does not know when this is going to happen, at least in terms of the day or the hour. So be on guard, stay awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man who goes on a journey, and when he leaves home, he puts his servants in charge, each with his own work to do, and he commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And here you almost need to imagine Jesus breaking the fourth wall and looking down the corridors of history at us and saying, what I say to you, the 12 disciples here and now, I say to everybody else forever, stay awake. That this is not just for them, this is for us. That the overall, and we're going to end here in a few minutes, the overall implication of this, according to Jesus, is to stay awake. So I'm going to say three things about this passage, and I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions afterwards, which I'm looking forward to. The first thing I want to say is just a couple of comments about how apocalyptic works as a genre. One of the things that's really hard about this is that we really don't have in movies, in literature, in newspapers, in social media, in communicating with one another, we don't really have a parallel today to what apocalyptic was in the ancient world. And so we kind of need to learn a new language, a new tongue in order to understand this. If any of you are interested on your own, or maybe it could be a group watch party at some point, one of the few exceptions to that in my limited experience is a great movie that came out 10 or 15 years ago. It's in Spanish, but it's got English subtitles, called Pan's Labyrinth. Anybody ever see Pan's Labyrinth? This is a fantastic movie. If you go back and you watch for the first time, or you rewatch Pan's Labyrinth, it is apocalyptic. And the fact that the director is a Latino man who grew up in the Catholic Church, I think is not unrelated to the fact that he understands apocalyptic. I don't want to ruin the movie if you've never seen it, but I'll just point this out. Part of the movie takes place in, you could say, real time, where it's basically set in the years leading up to World War II in Spain with the rise of fascism. And in the real-time story, it's just filled with evil and with tragedy. There's a little girl who's the main character of the story, and the other part of the story, and it goes back and forth. It's not like one part's the first half and the second part's the second half. It interweaves and goes back and forth. That the girl is also at the same time in what is kind of like a really dark, monstrous fairy tale with really fantastic creatures. And I don't want to ruin anything except to say this. If you understand what Pan's Labyrinth is doing, it is telling the same story from two different perspectives. That the fairy tale is the other story, but in such a way where you are enabled to see something about the real life story that you would have never been able to perceive if you were just looking at things literally, if you were just looking at things empirically. Apocalyptic is not about telling us ahead of time what's going to happen. It's about helping us to see what happens in this world, in history, from, there's a couple of ways you can say it. Let's say at the most basic level, the way God sees it, the way God interprets this event, that is helping us. Here's one way that I often say it, that apocalyptic is a genre that neither the New York Times nor Fox News are capable of. That apocalyptic, when things happen in history, see something, help us to see something that both the New York Times and Fox News, both a brilliant Harvard professor and some, popularizer who dropped out of high school and isn't educated, that they all would have missed, because apocalyptic is revealing something about what's really going on behind the scenes that our empirical five senses can't figure out. This is ultimately what the book of Revelation is about. The book of Revelation, and some of you are, I'm sure, really interested in Revelation. Very little of the book of Revelation is focused on or interested in the long-term future. Arguably, the only part of Revelation that has to do with the ultimate future is the last three chapters, Revelation 20 to 22. The rest of Revelation, and you should see it right away because it starts with 7 letters, the 7 churches in Asia Minor, who are all either being persecuted and pressured by the Roman Empire, or who are tempted and seduced and thinking about giving up their faithfulness to Jesus for the sake of what they could get if they turned away from that. And then the rest of the book of Revelation is kind of Pan's Labyrinth. It's monsters, it's dragons, it's like beasts with 4 heads, some of which are like lions, and some of which are this, and some of which are that, creatures that have like 17 eyes, things rising up out of the sea. And all of it is helping the early church see what is really going on right then and there, namely this Roman Empire that seems really attractive to you, right? Like you come to Harvard and you hope that it's a doorway into the top of Western culture. And to perceive that, to desire that, you need to see what's available in Western culture as desirable, as good, as beautiful. And all of the nightmarish, beastly images in Revelation are takes on what the Roman Empire really is. It's a prostitute. It's a monster. It's a beast. And then whenever there are these images of heavenly soldiers robed in white and triumphing over their enemies, if you read the book of Revelation rightly, it is actually an apocalyptic take on what's really going on when the Roman Empire pressures Christians, even to the point of martyrdom, and Christians refuse to take up the sword and violence to retaliate or to defend themselves. They refuse to deny their faith or to compromise, and instead they pay with their own blood the ultimate price that Jesus paid. That what is going on in those moments? They are conquering the world. The Christian church is the army of Jesus conquering the Roman Empire in those moments. That's what happens when Christians are getting thrown to the lions in the Colosseum. They're defeating the greatest empire in that day. Apocalyptic is about seeing what you would never guess if you were there on the scene. And the fact that apocalyptic imagery is often used at points in the biblical story that are otherwise pretty normal. A city getting destroyed, an innocent person being crucified, a temple being destroyed. All of this stuff happens all the time in the ancient world. None of it is eye-catching. And yet, apocalyptic imagery is used for it to enchant our imaginations to see what we would have never suspected. So let me give you a couple of examples, and then I'll move on back to Mark 13. Isaiah 13 is a passage you should go back to and look here. Much of the imagery in Mark 13 comes from Isaiah 13. We're not going to look at it for the sake of time, but all of the imagery of the sun going dark, the moon bleeding or failing to give its light, the stars falling from heaven, earthquakes and the powers of heaven being shaken is all used to describe the significance of Babylon being defeated in a military battle. That the ones who have taken us into exile are soon going to lose to another empire, which they did, and the significance of that is that the sun will stop shining, the moon will bleed, the stars will fall from heaven, that it's like the end of the world, even though, one, the world kept going on, history kept going on, and two, that's not a top 100 moment in history. Lots of empires have lost battles, lots of nations have risen and fallen. If you're an ancient historian, you're aware of that moment, but what Apocalyptic is teaching Israel is that was the hand of God intervening in history to bring judgment upon the oppressors. Let me give a really, contemporary example. If you know of anybody, and many of you probably do, contemporary Christians who are prone to always say COVID-19 is God's judgment on us, Hurricane Katrina is God's judgment on us because of this, and usually it reflects your own ideology, because not everybody believes what I believe, so God is judging them. And you just begin to interpret history through the lens of your own ideology. That Christians usually should be very reticent to think that we know what God is doing in historical moments. Most of history is profoundly ambiguous. Apocalyptic is saying, this moment at least, we have been told that God was at work there. Another example on the upside is Job was not being punished for his sins. That is not what that was. Apocalyptic gives us eyes to see something we would otherwise be unable to come to a conclusion about. Usually, we should be very hesitant, very agnostic, very humble about what we think God is up to in the vicissitudes of history. Apocalyptic shines a spotlight and says, this is what's going on. Let me give a couple of examples in addition to this. Joel chapter 2 is another apocalyptic section where all the imagery, the sun, the moon, the stars, all of it is there. And some of you will maybe remember, at least when I say this, that the Apostle Peter quotes Joel chapter 2 at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. And Peter gets up, and if you remember the background here, they're all sitting in this room in Acts 2. It's like 40 days after Jesus' death and resurrection, and they're all kind of like waiting. They're not quite sure what's going to happen. It's like 40, or Jesus has been kind of raised from the dead for 40 days, but now he's ascended into heaven, and the early disciples are waiting, not sure what's going to happen next. And the building starts shaking a little, but then like flames of fire appear above each disciple's head, and they start speaking in tongues. And here's how impressive that moment was empirically historically to those who are watching it. Anybody remember the reaction of the observers outside? Guys, 9 o'clock in the morning. Like, couldn't you wait a couple more hours to get plastered? Couldn't you wait a couple more hours to get drunk? Like, that's how impressive this moment was to literal physical sight. Looks like a bunch of Jewish guys are drunk too early in the day. That's how impressive Pentecost was. And Peter gets up and he says, as the prophet Joel once said, sun will go dark, the moon will bleed, the stars will fall from heaven, and God will pour out his spirit from on high. And this is that. This moment is what Joel was talking about. And there was no eclipse on that day. And the end of the world did not happen on that day. It's giving them imagery for the old covenant has been done away with, and God has finally poured out his spirit, and he has decisively invaded the world at Pentecost to kind of turn the battle of history decisively in the right direction. That's what this moment really is. And nothing literally happened there that's apocalyptic. Nobody in recorded history even mentions that day because it was as impressive as a bunch of Jewish guys who looked drunk. Let me give one more example, and then we'll move on. Maybe this is my favorite example. In 2 Kings chapter 6, this is Elisha, not Elijah. Elisha comes after Elijah, and he's sleeping in a town, and early in the morning, his servant boy is panicked and just really afraid, and he's waking him up. Elisha, wake up. And Elisha's like, what? Come on, dude, it's early in the morning. Why are you waking me up? And he points to the fact that overnight, as they've been sleeping, just the two of them, a vast army has surrounded them. And it's the two of them, and neither of them are even soldiers, and a vast army with chariots that has come with one purpose, to kill them. And Elisha has the most bizarre response ever. It's like, this is what you woke me up for? I'm going back to sleep. And then the servant boy won't calm down. He's still worried. And Elisha has this great prayer when he says, "Oh Lord, open this servant boy's eyes so that he might see that those who are with us are more than those who are against us." And the servant boy's eyes are opened, and he sees a vision of heavenly soldiers, heavenly chariots, heavenly hosts on high that protect them, and they end up being able to escape and get away. And none of anybody else who's on the scene would have known that. They would have just been like, man, here's this guy and this kid, and they weren't killed. You would expect that, when you bring that many soldiers against them, they would. And the whole point is, more is going on in history than just our eyes and ears can tell us. And apocalyptic is a genre God uses to enchant our imaginations to see what nobody else can see unless God unveils, reveals what is going on. This is the genre. The second point I'm going to go to in a second, but I always share this story or this illustration because I find it so helpful. Many of you are maybe struggling even right now with, this is interesting, but come on, like we can't just do whatever we want with the Bible. Like, we need to take the Bible seriously. We need to read it literally. We can't just, get rid of it because it's, not conducive to the modern spirit, or because we're embarrassed by it, or because it's, whatever. C.S. Lewis, who you all know, I'm sure, was once asked by somebody that I almost imagine that they asked this question with a sneer. C.S. Lewis, are you one of those Christians who reads the Bible literally? Right? Like, you're this Oxford, Cambridge professor, and yet you're like an Orthodox Christian? Like, come on, explain this to me. You don't really read the Bible literally, do you? And whenever anybody ever asks you that question, it's a trap, right? Like, there's no good way to answer that question in the modern world directly. But C.S. Lewis gives the best answer I've ever heard when he says, I don't read the Bible literally, I read it seriously. By which I mean, I read a poem as a poem, and I read history as history, and I read parables as parables, and I read songs as songs, and I read this as that. And then he gives this example, by which, when Jesus says that he wants his followers to be as innocent as doves, I've never understood him to mean that we're supposed to go lay eggs, right? Like what matters here is the intention of the author through the genre. And so the $1 million question is, what were these authors in the ancient world trying to say with this imagery? And often very conservative Christians have a high view of scripture, and we should have a high view of scripture, will often kind of immediately take the moral high ground and say, yeah, but I read it literally. but that's actually a category mistake. The question is, what did these authors mean by this? And you can't just assume that your intuitions are a better reflection of what these authors meant than somebody else's are. I want to argue that this language is not a one-to-one correspondence with what happens in history, but instead goes indirectly through our imagination so that we look again at what's happening in history, but see it from a new angle. And so here's the second thing I want to say. And I'm going to go through this one quickly because the third point is what I really want to say tonight. The second thing is this. If you have Mark 13 open, I encourage you to look at it. I kind of alluded to this briefly. I don't think this chapter is about the end of the world. I don't think this chapter is about the second coming of Jesus. I don't think this chapter is about Jesus is one day literally gonna come back down on the clouds. I do think that Jesus is coming back someday. I do think there's an ultimate future, but I don't think that's what this is about. Here's what it's about. It's not about thousands and thousands of years later, at best. It might even be much longer than that by the time the Lord returns. We'll talk about that in a minute, that this passage is about what's gonna happen within a generation as a result of Jesus's death and resurrection, namely that in 70 AD, the Roman Empire surrounded the city of Jerusalem, and as the culmination of 4 years of a siege from 66 AD to 70 AD, in the course of which about 1 million people died overall and were starved to death and were killed, that finally the Roman Empire broke through and they destroyed the city and they burned the temple to the ground. Mark 13 is helping us understand what that moment was about. And it's what Jesus has been talking about constantly in the last week of his life. You don't need to turn there, but ever since Jesus has ridden into Jerusalem in Mark 11, almost every single story is about Jesus's judgment on the temple. The fig tree is barren, and Jesus curses it in Mark 11. And then he goes into the temple and he overturns tables and he drives out tax collectors. And then he goes back to the fig tree and says, no fruit will ever come from you again. The fig tree is a parable of judgment on a temple that's supposed to be bearing fruit, supposed to be a place of God's presence and God's grace, a place where the nations are attracted to who God is, and yet it is filled with vipers and hypocrites. And so it needs to come down. But on the other hand, he immediately goes on to say, but whenever you pray in my name, you will receive what you've asked. Whenever you forgive one another or seek forgiveness in my name, you will be forgiven. And we just were like, okay, yeah, like we know that, Jesus. But what Jesus is saying is from now on, what you used to need to go to the temple to get, answered prayer, forgiveness of sins, you now get through Jesus, not this building. That one temple's coming down and another temple's going up. And when Jesus is at his trial in Mark 14, this is the accusation. That he said he would destroy this temple and in 3 days raise it up. Now that's a false accusation, but only because Jesus didn't say he would do that. He said God would do that, that the Father would do that. But they have heard rightly what Jesus said. In fact, that otherwise enigmatic scene where Jesus flips over tables in the temple and he shuts down the animals that are being sold by the money changers, that's not Jesus trying to purify the temple. That's not Jesus saying, you shouldn't have a Starbucks in the back of your church or sell, novelty t-shirts in church, although you probably shouldn't. That's not what that scene is about. That scene is about prophetic symbolism. Jesus is temporarily shutting down the people of God's ability to offer sacrifices as a preview of the fact that the whole operation is about to cease because God is about to judge this place. And then on the cross, in Mark 15, as he is hanging on the cross, the accusation of the mockers is, here's the guy who said he would bring this temple down. Almost everything in these final chapters of Jesus's life are about the temple. And now let me give you a couple of reasons from Mark 13 that this is an apocalyptic interpretation of the significance of what happened in 70 AD when the Roman Empire destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the temple was burned down. And many of you know the temple has never been rebuilt in the last 2,000 years. Judaism became rabbinic Judaism. Muslims and Jews and Christians still fight over the Holy Land, but the temple has never been rebuilt and sacrifices are not offered, animal sacrifices by Jews or by Christians. And this is the moment. But from a secular historical standpoint, this is just one more religious building being destroyed by a stronger army. This has happened 10,000 times in history. It's not that unique a moment. But what Jesus is saying is, this is the act of judgment of Israel's God upon a people to whom God has sent to us, his prophets, one after another over the centuries, and we have not listened. We were hard of heart, and finally he sends his son, and then they kill him and throw him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and he will destroy the vineyard and he will lease it out to other tenants. That is, that now Israel is defined around Jesus, not around the temple. This is another decisive shift in redemptive history. That's what God is up to at this moment in history. So let's go back to Mark 13. And real quickly, let me just give you a couple of reasons that once you have this lens, I think it actually becomes very obvious. The first reason within Mark 13 to think this is about the temple is just look at verse 1 and 2 again. The first observation is, whoa, Jesus, look at this temple. This thing's really amazing. It's really big. It's really beautiful. And Jesus's response in verse 2 is to say, yeah, this whole thing's coming down. There's not going to be one stone left upon another. And then verse 3 and 4 is literally the disciples responding by saying, can you tell us when that's going to happen? There's no context here for, like, when's the world going to end? When are you going to come back in the future? Right? Like, the disciples don't even get at this point that he's going to die and rise again. They're not even thinking in the category of, like, when's the ultimate future going to come and you return? This is, whoa, the temple's going to be destroyed. Like, when's that going to happen, Jesus? And what are the signs that we could tell before it happens? And then the rest of the chapter is Jesus's response. Here's a couple of other reasons. The fig tree reappears in verse 28. Learn from the fig tree how to tell time, but that showed up in chapter 11 as a symbol of the temple. But this is about the temple. More significantly, if you look at the middle of chapter 13, like verses 14 through 23, all that weird abomination of desolation stuff, Jesus mentions that those who are in Judea, verse 14, should flee to the mountains. This is the end of the world. And if this is Jesus coming back again, like, what about people like in New Jersey? And what about people like in Egypt? Like, why are those in Judea especially relevant here? And then, and I don't mean to be crude, but like Jesus's advice is run. Now, if this is Jesus coming back in the future, can you imagine Jesus being, when it happens, run, flee, right? Like, this doesn't make sense if this is the end of the world. And then he prays, pray that your women might not be pregnant or nursing early children. Doesn't really matter if this is the end of all things. Pray that it might not happen in winter. And then not only has nothing ever been as bad as this, but nothing will ever be as bad as this again, which means that, like, there's going to be things after this to compare it to. All of this assumes that this is local, that this is not the end of the world, and that it's something specific. And then, as I said, last thing I'll mention for now is that Jesus says it is all within a generation. Okay, thanks for the heads up. I'm going to wrap it up here in a couple of minutes. And then, for those of you who want to check it out, there's three gospels that are connected: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew and Mark are both written probably by Jewish Christians for largely Jewish audiences. Luke is written by a Gentile to a Gentile audience. And I would encourage you to go read Luke 21. When Mark and Matthew talk about when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not to be, run, pray it not happen in winter, Luke translates that. You could almost see Luke as apocalyptic for dummies, us Gentiles for whom this is not our native tongue. Luke retranslates that as, instead of when you see the abomination of desolation, he translates it as when you see armies surrounding Jerusalem, because this is not the end of the world. It's a very historical event that would take place within a generation, the significance of which would be that the Son of Man came. This is the vindication of Jesus. The sun went dark. God withdrew his grace upon the temple, and he allowed his enemies to destroy it. That's what was really happening when Rome destroyed this building 40 years later. So last thing, and I'm going to do this quickly, and then if you want to talk about this more, we can do it in Q&A. That's all really interesting, but right, like, who the heck cares? Like, that happened 2,000 years ago. what does this have to do with us? And the whole chapter ends with what I'm saying to these guys with respect to this situation. I'm saying to all of you for the rest of time, stay awake, which is this is how apocalyptic works. Even Jesus says, I don't really know the day or the hour this is going to happen. Like I kind of know what's coming, but I don't even know exactly when this happens. It'll happen within a generation. Apocalyptic almost never, and I'm tempted to say never, tells us ahead of time what's coming so that you don't need to read the newspaper, or so that you can like bet the stock market really well. To put it crude, Christians don't know what's coming in the future any more than anybody else. That's not why our hope is our hope. Here's what we do know about the future. I've got a thing I'm going to put up on the screen and I'll email it to you guys, but I just want you to notice, for the sake of time, I'm going to reduce it to just a couple of things. I want you to notice a couple of the ways that Jesus describes what's coming in the next generation. Specifically, that Jesus says at the very end of the chapter, verse 35, therefore stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come. And then this is almost always easy to miss, that Jesus gives 4 time periods when the master might come: in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows. That's the one that should catch your eye because you know that one. Or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you sleeping. Therefore, stay awake. One of the things, I'm going to very briefly put this up on the screen. One of the things commentators have noticed for centuries since the early church is that almost every image Jesus uses in Mark 13 reappears in the passion of Jesus in Mark 14 and 15. Jesus will stand before a Jewish council and Gentile kings and governors. Jesus will be beaten. Jesus will be betrayed by his family, Judas. He will be deserted by his followers. There will be all kinds of conflict. There will be the abomination of desolation is language for blasphemy. Judas handing Jesus over, and above all else, Jesus being crucified by Jews and Gentiles is the most blasphemous, sacrilegious act that has ever happened in human history. Everything that Jesus says in Mark 13, before it happens to Jerusalem 40 years later, happens to him in the next 24 hours. Every single description is there. And just to give you the most obvious ones, the passion account in Mark 14 and 15 is not only structured by these 4 periods of time: evening, midnight, rooster crow, morning, but they appear in that order. The Last Supper is evening. Gethsemane is midnight. Peter denying Jesus and running away when he's at trial is rooster crow, and Jesus is crucified in the morning. Those 4 time words will explicitly appear, and each time they appear in Mark 14 and 15, the next thing that's said is Jesus is coming. Jesus is coming. That evening, and he came and he sat down with his disciples. Midnight, he came and he prayed in the garden. Rooster crow, and Jesus came and he looked at Peter, and Peter wept because he done. And morning, he came and he was handed over and he was crucified. Now, look at Gethsemane in chapter 14. We're going to end with this. Chapter 14, verses 32 and following, Jesus is in Gethsemane, and he says over and over and over again the same thing he said in chapter 13: stay awake, stay awake, stay awake. And the disciples fall asleep, fall asleep, fall asleep. Now notice this. Verse 36, Jesus says, chapter 14, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but you want. And then he came and he found them sleeping. Look at Mark 13, verse 35. Therefore stay awake, Peter and James and John and Andrew. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning. And in all 4 scenes in the next chapter and a half, the disciples have fled. They have not stayed awake. They have not stayed faithful. And each scene is an instance of the Son of Man coming on the scene, being revealed who he is, and they miss it. They miss it. They miss it. Some of you might remember this or have connected dots. None of them are there at the cross. They have all abandoned him. They have all fled. Here's 2 things I'm going to say as we wrap up, and then we can do Q&A. One of the things Apocalyptic is doing is reminding us that what God has done in the past sets the pattern for the kinds of things he will do in the future. The relationship between Mark 13, Apocalyptic, and what happens to Jesus in Mark 14 and 15 is to say this, among other things. What happened to Jerusalem in 70 AD? What happened to the church in the 2nd century, in the 3rd century, in the 14th century? What happens to us today? That we can never know ahead of time what exactly it will look like, but we can always know that it will be the church being called to stay awake with Jesus in Gethsemane, with the same kind of trials that Jesus went through, with the same kind of opposition from the outside, with the same kind of betrayals from the inside, and with the same call that God is working out his kingdom purposes here and there, that even though I promise you for the rest of your life, you will be regularly surprised by the future, and I cannot tell you a single thing about it, I can also tell you that if you know the story of Jesus, you will always be able to recognize the future when it comes, because it will be a recapitulation for the church of what happened to Jesus in Mark 14 and 15, that we will suffer with him and we will be glorified with him. That pattern, here's the last image I want to give you. When I was a kid, probably this isn't used very often anymore. There was this thing called tracing paper, where if you saw an image somewhere, you put a piece of tracing paper over it and you kind of traced it. And then you could take the image and you can put it here. Here's what Jesus is doing in Mark 13. And all Apocalyptic is doing. It is taking Jesus's suffering, his death, and his resurrection in Mark 14 or 15, putting a piece of tracing paper over it and getting the pattern, and then putting a map of all future history up and saying, here's what's coming. That over and over and over again. We will always be tempted in exactly the same way the disciples are here. We will always need to stay awake like they need to stay awake here. We will always face the same kinds of opposition Jesus did. We will always be called to the same kind of faithfulness. And on the other side of every suffering, every heartbreak, every death, there will always be resurrection. This is the shape of history. This is what we can expect. Doesn't mean that you know specifically what's going to happen, but if you know this, you know the secret to recognizing it when it comes. These are the things to look for. These are the things that matter. We're always with Jesus in Gethsemane, tempted to fall asleep, tempted to run away, but called to stay awake until the Son of Man comes. And he will come one day. But along the way, this is the pattern that we expect. This is how our imaginations ought to be shaped to be ready for what comes next. That faithfulness versus unfaithfulness, suffering with Christ rather than pursuing your selfish desires, these are always the choices that history finally presents to us. That's what really matters, which is why, to come all the way back to where I started, what matters above all else in history, and I really do mean this, guys, infinitely more important, and some of you, if you want to accuse me of blasphemy in a minute in Q&A, you can, infinitely more important than the death and resurrection of Jesus 2,000 years ago, infinitely more important than what is coming in the future, is whether you stay awake here and now as you follow Jesus. Because nothing he died and rose for will be accomplished in your life, and nothing that is coming in the future will finally come to you as God's promise if you fall asleep and turn away from the Son of Man right now. All of this is so that we would stay awake right here, right now, and we imagine the future, we remember the past, so that we come back and we stay awake. So sorry I went over a little over time there, guys. Let me throw it out to however you guys want to do the Q&A. I think maybe there's a document here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick, for that. I mean, shoot, I couldn't even write fast enough for all of this. So I'm excited to jump right into the Q&A. And I think the first question, the most light question right now is, how much Revelation should we interpret literally? In fact, how much of the Bible do we interpret literally?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, probably the most helpful thing to do in response to that question is to press in on what does the word literally mean there. And the word literally tends to do a lot of different things for different people. Some people, it means like what's said here is exactly corresponding to the way it happens in history. That is, it's not symbolic. It's not a metaphor. You can use literally like that if you want. I don't think that's a very good way to use it literally. You can use it as like, understanding the Bible to have authority over us rather than our instincts having authority over the Bible. That, which is good. The Bible should have authority over us. But in the ancient world, some of you will remember this, even in the early church, there were 4 senses of scripture. And the first and the primary one was the literal sense. And all that meant was what the author meant. And so if he meant a poem, then it's a poem. If he meant symbolism, it's symbolism. It doesn't mean like literal in this truncated, reduced sense. It just means whatever the person meant when he or she said this, that's what controls what I understand by that. And so literal is not about correspondence to reality. It's about intention of the communicator. In that sense, yes, we should always read the Bible literally. If you mean something more specific, one-to-one correspondence with history, no metaphor, no symbolism, you should not read the Bible literally, because the Bible often does not work that way. Sometimes it is just straightforward history. I'm not saying all of it is, just like it depends on the genre and what the author is trying to do. And so the intention of the author, which can only at best be recovered by knowing history, genre, and how language, and syntax, and grammar works, that's kind of what we're looking for. And in one of the main arguments tonight is apocalyptic is, in our parlance today, a decidedly non-literal genre. It's a genre that is metaphorical, that is symbolic, that is primarily seeking to appeal to our imagination, and it's not a genre that is trying to tell us the specifics of the future, at least not in any really comprehensive way, the way that I think some Christian traditions in the modern world have come to understand it that way.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that answer. The next question we have is, how should suffering from chronic pain be viewed in light of the future and the apocalyptic?
That is such a great question. I probably got 35 years through my life. I'm currently 41. I'll be 42 this summer without it, just honestly, nothing but the grace of God, not because I was in great shape with exercise or eating healthy, but just kind of got through life without much pain. And only a few of you probably know this, Don Weiss and some others, the last 5 years of my life have been pretty dominated by chronic pain. And it has been one of the greatest challenges of my life. I've regularly just felt so overwhelmed by it. But by God's grace, I won't bore you with details right now. It's gotten a little better in the last 2 years, but I have not experienced my body in a normal way for over 5 years. I have been in pain 24/7 to some real degree or not for over 5 years. And it has been one of the great challenges of my life. And so I don't want to answer this in a cheap way, as if, oh, now you understand it, now it's okay. I do think apocalyptic, maybe this will be helpful. One of the distinctions between eschatology, it's a topic, it's a theme, and apocalyptic as a genre, is eschatology and apocalyptic overlap. They're not completely different, but most scholars and historians would say that eschatology shows up earlier in Israel's story, and apocalyptic shows up pretty late. Like apocalyptic as a genre is Daniel 7-12, which is very late. Zechariah 9-14, certainly very late. Which, by the way, Zechariah 9-14, along with Daniel 7-12, the other really big apocalyptic section of the Old Testament, not usually known very well by us today, very influential in Revelation, and it is quoted far more often than anything else in the final week of Jesus's life in the Gospels. By the way, I didn't even, I don't want to get off topic from this, but I ran out of time and forgot to mention this. What happens when Jesus is dying on the cross in the Gospels? The sun goes dark, there's an earthquake, the temple veil is torn. If you read Matthew, the dead get out of their graves in Jerusalem and come out. Like, it's all apocalyptic stuff to say. What a historian, if they were there, would have said, here's one more misinformed Jewish guy who decided to take on the Roman Empire and ended up on a cross. Tens of thousands of stories ended like that in the first century. What this really was the end of the world and the beginning of a new one, which is why our calendar is still BC and AD. That's what that moment really was. If Fox News and the New York Times were there, they would have said, what really matters is what's going on in Rome. What really matters is Trump or Biden. That's what really is where history goes. And what the gospel is saying, this man dying on a cross is the most significant event in the history of the universe. That's what this imagery is about. It's not like, oh, literally the sun went dark. I do think probably the sun went dark there, but even the literal sun going dark is to convey symbolism. Symbolism is what's important. That's what this moment really is, that God judged sin and death decisively in that moment. And on Easter Sunday, a new creation began. You do not understand those moments rightly unless you see that. And so apocalyptic, coming back to chronic pain, apocalyptic develops late in Israel's history, and I think that this is probably right. It's hard to prove, but I think it's probably right, is apocalyptic is a genre that Jews and Christians appealed to, resorted to, only when the world was so dominated by injustice, so nightmarishly chaotic with immorality, and the good guys are losing and the bad guys are winning and the oppressors are having their way and the righteous are suffering. Apocalyptic is a genre that you tend to resort to when it becomes impossible to make sense of the world through your eyes and through your ears. And this is the only way you can now make sense of it, that behind the scenes, God is doing this, and in the future, this will soon come. And so I would say, maybe hopefully this is helpful. There's so much about chronic pain. By the way, a book for anyone dealing with chronic pain or knows someone dealing with chronic pain is This Too Shall Last. Is maybe the best Christian counseling book on chronic pain I've ever read. Would just commend that to people. I would say to encourage you, there is no guarantee that chronic pain will ever no longer be my experience in this life. There is no guarantee that chronic pain will not become your experience in the future, or if you have it now, that it will necessarily go away. We should pray for it to go away. We should hate that it doesn't. We should grieve and lament and all that. But one, there's no guarantee that this world will ever be the full reckoning of God setting right that's gone wrong. But here's, I think, at least to me, what's encouraging about apocalyptic, which is, but this is not the last chapter in the story. This is not where the story ends. That there will be in the future, even if it looks different for each person. For some of us, it'll be on the other side of resurrection. For some of us, it'll be after 3 years or after 7 years, but it will eventually be healed. It will eventually not be allowed to have the final word. And besides the fact that I think that's true, that this life is not all there is, that if you've ever been sick for 6 months or 6 days, that if you got better, it did bring a new perspective to what maybe felt despairing in the longer season when you were sick, that's coming for all of us, that's the hope we have in the gospel. But it also means practically that you don't need to spiritualize away your chronic pain. You don't need to spiritualize away your suffering and say, this is actually good because look at all this stuff God is doing through it. It's evil and it's awful and it ought not to be. You don't need to, even though this is often the hardest thing in the world, you don't need to despair over it or finally lose heart, but you are allowed to hate it, to grieve over it, to feel overwhelmed by it, and to long for the day when it's gone. That it allows you to see it as, maybe to put it this way, a chapter in your story rather than the whole story. I think apocalyptic helps us to rename it that way, but I do not want to make light at how unbelievably challenging some forms of suffering are when they endure for a long time.
Thank you very much for that thorough answer. I think we have time for just about one more question. So the question is, how does Israel fit into eschatology? What does Paul mean when he speaks of the temporary hardening of Israel till the fullness of Gentiles are grafted in?
That's a great question. That's a big question that some of you are probably aware of. There's a lot of debate and a lot of controversy over it. The most persuasive overall take that I know on this is we need to stay away from two extremes on this question, and just want to acknowledge that in the modern world, both on this side of the Holocaust in particular, and in light of the not I don't want to say it's the major theme of church history. I don't think that's true, but nonetheless, it is not, anti-Semitism is not a minor or rare theme in Christian history. And whatever we say about this needs to be said in light of that. I don't think the Holocaust is a revelatory moment in history. I don't think it means that we need to change our theology, but it does mean that our tone of voice needs to change. And it does mean the relationships we build with our Jewish friends need to be done differently at this point in history than were happening in the first century for Paul and Peter. And so in my mind, without giving too much defense of it right now, I'm going to use 3 R words that N.T. Wright likes to use, that Israel on the other side of Jesus's death and resurrection is neither rejected or replaced, nor are they reaffirmed as if nothing has changed in Jesus's death and resurrection. Rather, Israel is redefined so that if Jews are no longer automatically in, they're also not automatically out. And if Gentiles are no longer automatically out, they're also not automatically in. Just as, and this is what Paul does in Romans 9, just as Esau and Jacob, just as Isaac and Ishmael equally come biologically, ethnically from Abraham, one is Israel and the other is not, which means that ethnicity is not sufficient ever, even in the Old Testament, to define Israel. And along the way of the Old Testament, Israel is constantly being redefined. Even after the destruction of the temple, Israel gets redefined and now becomes only or primarily observance of Torah and not temple worship and animal sacrifice anymore. Israel has been redefined many times in history. Arguably, if anybody wants to pursue this, arguably the best way to define the differences between the Pharisees, Sadducees, the Qumran community, and the early church is they were all rival interpretations of what Israel means, who Israel is. And I would say that the early church came to the conclusion that Israel is all those, both Jew and Gentile, who confess that the crucified, risen Jesus is Lord over all. Now that raises lots of questions. What about non-Messianic ethnic Jews now? And that is complicated even in the New Testament, because Paul does make it clear, even though being born Jewish doesn't mean you're automatically in on the other side of the Messiah. Arguably, it never did. And just as being born a Gentile doesn't mean you're automatically out, a non-believing Jew is in a different position than those of us who are Gentiles as non-Christians. That God's faithfulness relates to ethnic Israel in a way that's different than the way God relates to the Irish or to Africans or to Brazilians or to Russians, that the ethnic people of Israel still bear a role in history. And of course, the big debate is, what does that mean? Like what will happen there? Probably not even worth me trying to say what I think that means. But I do think, on the one hand, any Christian church that understands the gospel needs to not only say that Israel, our Jewish friends, are welcome into the church, but that there is still, in a very real sense, a priority of, in Romans, the Jew first and then the Gentile. But probably the danger today, especially in a place like Cambridge or here in New York City, is to say, you know what, all this anti-Semitism, you know what, Jesus is for Gentiles, not for Jews. And I don't think you can say that. I think you're denying the gospel, and I think you're failing to love your Jewish friends if you do that. I think the way we talk to our Jewish friends must take into account the profound levels of Christian unfaithfulness towards the Jewish people throughout history. It must. You can't say, yeah, but look at Romans. You can't do that. But you also can't change what Romans says because it's uncomfortable or puts you in an inconvenient position. And so I think all the people of God throughout history, Old Covenant, New Covenant, before Jesus, with Jesus, are what Paul means by the Israel of God. And so I think we are included in the Israel of God, but I think it's also much bigger than us.
Awesome answer. Thank you so much for that. So again, thank you so much for the great talk tonight. It's very insightful. A lot of us, our minds are blown, which is great. So DOXA is not over yet. We're about to go into